Hey everyone, Sam here, otherwise known as FPL Pricey, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at all of the key players to buy ahead of Game Week 21, including some key head-to-head decisions. Right then, so let's kick off with one of the key comparisons this week, but before we do, if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel, that would mean the world to me, and it is really helpful for the channel as well. So thank you in advance if you do enjoy the video and you feel inclined to do either of those two things. First up is Gordon versus Mbeumo, and this is a key matchup for a lot of people this week. Both of them are amongst the highest transferred in midfielders, and both of them, I would say, do actually have really good fixtures coming. Now, the problem with Mbeumo is, of course, on the ticker, it looks quite poor over the next few game weeks. Lots of red, lots of yellow there. But if you look at each fixture individually, I don't think it's all that bad. Now, Mbeumo is a player that I already own, so maybe there's a sprinkling of bias here, but I genuinely think that he is a good player to own in the next few game weeks, and I bought him in only a couple of weeks ago for this run, thinking it was going to be really beneficial for him. Now, obviously, 19 points against Southampton last week isn't going to be replicated every single week, but Brentford have scored in all but one of their home games so far this season, Nottingham Forest being the only one in which they haven't done, and they've hauled in a lot of them as well, so lots of big returns on offer there. And despite the fact that it is Man City next up, I think that matchup in particular is something that I really like the look of for Mbeumo, who almost certainly will be playing in a front two as part of a 3-5-2 formation, which Brentford tend to use against the stronger opponents. Man City have also conceded far more bigger chances than they ever have done previously in seasons gone past, and are much more susceptible on the break, something Brentford absolutely specialise in. So I really like Mbeumo for that matchup in particular. I'm not going to lie to you and say that I love the Liverpool matchup, because that's not an easy game, but I think as a total of 5 fixtures, Liverpool being the only one that I'm really that fussed by, but it's still at home and Brentford do usually score at home anyway. After that, it's Palace away, Tottenham at home, which I think, again, much like Man City, is a really good matchup. And then West Ham away from home, who are under new management but have been really porous all season long. Now, Mbeumo's data is good. 0.31 XG per 90 is pretty good for a midfielder, and especially at his price point, very strong. But he is unquestionably overperforming on his underlying data. 13 goals so far is miles ahead. In fact, I think he's the highest overperforming player in the league so far this season when it comes to goals versus their XG per 90. However, Mbeumo has still got good data. It's just not quite as good as Gordon's. Now, on to Gordon in particular, little bit cheaper, of course, and owned by fewer managers, but that is creeping up week on week, and I think it's 5 attacking returns in the last 5 game weeks, 1 per week. He's been very consistent, and although he got off to maybe a slightly slow start in FPL this season, the data has always been really strong. His XG per 90, even without the penalties, is stronger than Bryan Mbeumo's is. And although he's only scored 5 goals, his expected data suggests that he should be outscoring Mbeumo in terms of goals alone. Obviously, they match each other in terms of the assist threat per 90, and Gordon has actually produced a couple more than Mbeumo has, which maybe balances out a little bit, but overall, he's still a fantastic player to own, and Newcastle generally look like a great team to be backing right now, and almost all of us have Alexander Isak in our teams, so it doesn't really help us anymore. So if you want to double up on the attack, I would look no further than Anthony Gordon. I might mess around with someone like Jacob Murphy, but his minutes aren't fantastic, and I do feel like Gordon is the more sustainable pick. And if you can squeeze some extra budget, I would try to have both of these midfielders if you possibly can. If I was buying one right now, I think I'd very slightly lean towards Anthony Gordon, just because the next 4 fixtures in particular are so good. Wolves, Bournemouth, both at home, then Southampton away, who are very leaky, and then Fulham at home is a good run, and then they've got the Man City fixture, which again, I like the matchup for. So if I was buying one of them right now, I would very slightly lean towards Anthony Gordon. I don't have him. I do have Bryan Mbeumo. And what I will wrap up this segment by saying is, if I had Mbeumo or Gordon, there is no way I'd be making a transfer from one to the other in either direction right now. They are both very good picks in their own right. I absolutely won't be selling Bryan Mbeumo for Anthony Gordon this game week because I love the matchup. If I could get both, that would be fantastic, but I don't think it's worth a transfer, which is very precious at the moment, to move from one to the other. Quick final point, I did say I'd wrap this section up, but one little thing to remember is down the line, Newcastle are 2-0 up in their Carabao Cup semi-final against Arsenal. That makes them slightly more likely to get through to the final. Obviously, there could be a turnaround. There could be a comeback in the reverse tie. But it does mean that Newcastle are slightly more likely now. I think about 85% more likely than not to get a blank in game week 29, which is basically a blank game week for anyone who has the final in the Carabao Cup that week. So Newcastle look likely to blank all the way down the line in game week 29. It's a long way off yet, but it is just something to start thinking about in the back of your mind, having a chip strategy or transfer strategy for that if you want to double or triple up on Newcastle. So on to the second key matchup in midfield that a lot of managers are asking about right now, and that is which Man United midfielder, if any, should we be buying ahead of game week 21. Now, game week 21, straight up, is a fantastic fixture. Southampton at home, it really couldn't get much better than that. And obviously Southampton, even under the new manager, look very susceptible to some really big score lines against them. So although they're not playing out from the back quite as much, they're still very porous, and Man United could absolutely capitalise on that. Now, it is worth noting that under Amorim, they've not exactly been explosive. The data's not been terrible, but they've been inconsistent at best, and it's only been in the really big games against Man City and Liverpool that they've massively turned up. And although they've not looked that bad on the eye, I would say generally speaking, there's still a lot left to be answered for in the Amorim system, and I'm sure he'll turn it around. He looks like a very good coach, but it's early days, and I'm not expecting Man United to be at their full-flowing attacking best that we saw seasons and seasons and seasons ago now. So let's not expect miracles, but both of these assets have a lot going for them, and the fixtures, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, over the next 5 game weeks do look really, really promising. So, like I said, Southampton to start with, Brighton after that, Fulham, Crystal Palace, Tottenham, 3 home games in the next 5. Even that Tottenham away game looks pretty likely for some goals, and both Bruno and Amad Diallo look like good options. So the question is, if you wanted to bring in a Man United midfielder, which again, I would have absolutely nothing against. I've got Amad Diallo myself right now. Which one would you favour, given that they're at very different price points, and of course the data looks pretty different for both of them as well. Now, Bruno Fernandes, to start off with, is more expensive, 3 million more expensive than his teammate Amad, so that is obviously a huge asterisk here, that you can't really get to Bruno as easy as Amad, and he takes up maybe a different spot in your team. He's probably more of a competitor for the likes of Mbeumo or Gordon, that 3rd or maybe 4th midfield spot, whereas Amad Diallo is very much your 4th or 5th midfielder in almost all cases, and can be brought in for pretty much anyone. So Bruno Fernandes is kind of fighting not only against his own teammate here, but also against the players I've already talked about, like Gordon and Mbeumo, but his data holds up really well against them. 0.36 XG per 90 is better than Mbeumo's. He also has penalties like Mbeumo does, very similar minutes, 90 minutes a match almost every single week, and not far off Anthony Gordon's either. So very similar there, a little bit more expensive, but you do get the benefit of 90 minutes a match and penalties over that of Anthony Gordon. So he's definitely in the conversation for me if you were looking at a player around this price point. 0.8 million more expensive than Gordon, though, isn't nothing, and you can do a lot more with that money. So I completely understand if straight away you don't want to put all of your chips into a pretty expensive Man United midfielder when someone like Anthony Gordon or Bryan Mbeumo is staring you in the face. However, if you were set on targeting that Southampton fixture in particular, but also the run in general, Bruno Fernandes does look like a pretty solid pick. The data suggests he's been quite unlucky in front of goal in terms of the goal output, but the assist output is ticking along really nicely. The expected points over the next 5 also looks really good, and 25.5 is right in the mix with the likes of Gordon and Mbeumo in the last section, but also, crucially, a couple of points ahead of Amad Diallo at 22.9. Now, this is where we kind of come on to the decision making here, as whether or not it's worth 3 million to upgrade, in your thinking at least, from an Amad to a Bruno. Obviously, you won't be selling Amad this week. That would be kind of bizarre, I would say, but if you were making one transfer or the other, would you want to make that upgrade, that leap up to Bruno Fernandes for 3 million more? And although the data does look quite a lot better, especially that XG per 90, in fact double as good as Amad Diallo's is, I would suggest that the money is actually pretty well saved here. He's much like Bruno, he's been getting very, very good minutes recently under Amorim. The data also is across the whole season, and what we've seen from Amad is he's been playing much more regular football and been much more influential in the attacking positions for Man United since Amorim has come in. So this data is on an upwards trajectory, and although it doesn't look great across the season, for his price point, it's still very competitive with the likes of Morgan Rogers, for example. Now, if you were to sell Morgan Rogers this week, I think Amad Diallo is probably the correct replacement. But again, I probably wouldn't be ripping up my side to bring in a Man United player, even though it is a great fixture this week. They can be very stop-start, and I think they are still figuring out the best players to fit into what is a pretty well-set formation. And Amad Diallo, although playing an attacking role at the moment, could very easily go back to a more withdrawn, but still fairly attacking right wing-back role, where maybe the goal threat will go down, but the assist threat might go up a little bit. So, for what it's worth, I like both of these players right now. I can't really get to Bruno Fernandes myself. If you've got an opportunity to get there and it doesn't prevent you from getting to one of Bryan Mbeumo or Anthony Gordon, I do quite like it. I probably would be favouring both Mbeumo and Gordon over him right now, personally. But if you wanted a cheaper player and you're looking at the best cheap midfielders to go for this week, I wouldn't look any further than Amad Diallo, who I believe is a very good price point. The data is on the up. He's playing in a fairly advanced role, and the fixtures, of course, as we've discussed, are looking very promising. I also think that it is worth the saving of 3 million over Bruno Fernandes, despite the fact that the minutes aren't quite as secure, and of course he doesn't have the penalties. Right then, so with the questionable injury on João Pedro, who, by the way, looks like he's sprained his ankle, he's going in for an MRI scan at the moment, and it looks likely that we also might not hear anything before the deadline concrete anyway. If we see him in training pictures, that's obviously a little bit different. We'll probably get something like that before the deadline, but nothing concrete from Hertzler. However, if he is injured, or it looks likely that he's injured, it's worth looking at some of the most likely replacements, or of course, both of these players look like very decent forwards right now anyway, so you might just be looking at downgrading one of your other forward spots, maybe even a Nicholas Jackson, for example, to someone a bit cheaper to save some money and spend it elsewhere. If that is the case, these are probably the two forwards that would most likely take my eye. Raul Jimenez will obviously come as no surprise. 2 goals in the previous game week, 1 the week before that. He is definitely in some good form. It is worth noting, of course, that the 2 goals he scored, the brace, was a brace of penalties, and it's not like you can repeat that week after week. You will get penalties at random incidents across the season, and it is, of course, very helpful for a striker to have them, but you can't rely on them as a consistent means of returning. It's kind of like a little added bonus that you attach to a player to give them maybe the edge over someone else around the same price point. Raul Jimenez absolutely does have that. He's got a great penalty record and good underlying data, especially for the price point at under 6 million. So he definitely could be a good João Pedro replacement or a good forward to bring in. However, despite the fact he's scored 8 goals, got 10 attacking returns so far this season, I'm still maybe a little bit hesitant on him. And I think the reason for that is they've got a good backup striker in the likes of Rodrigo Muniz, and although he's not starting all the time, he does steal minutes off of Jimenez fairly consistently, and has, of course, got the odd start here or there. It's not very long ago that we saw Muniz starting ahead of Jimenez either, so it only really takes a couple of poor performances, or maybe even a fitness concern, not even an injury, for that to maybe turn in the other direction and Muniz maybe gets the odd start. Now, the fixtures to come are looking pretty decent. I'd say the next 2 are the particularly good ones. After that, Man United, Newcastle, Nottingham Forest, it's not looking quite as good. And maybe because of that, unless you're looking for a very short-term striker, I don't think I could highly recommend Raul Jimenez right now. He's obviously a great player. The data's really good. But for me, the minutes are just a little bit shaky. And I think after the next 2 game weeks, which are admittedly very good opportunities for big points, after that, I think he's probably going to be a sell for most of us. And if I was to buy him now, I'd be worried that it's another transfer I'm going to want to use in a couple of weeks. Whether or not he gets dropped or the minutes reduce, the fixtures just aren't really there after that. If you've already got him, obviously you keep him, you start him, you play him in the next 2 fixtures. But if you don't, I would be tempted to have a look elsewhere and see what else you can get around this price point. And that's where Johan Wissa comes into the discussion. Now, a little bit more expensive, of course, but the data, XG-wise per 90, is fairly significantly better than Raul Jimenez, and his minutes have been really good as well this season. He's also got a couple more attacking returns, 9 goals, 3 assists, and over the next 5, thanks to Fantasy Football Hub, we are expecting him to score a little bit more strongly than Jimenez, although the fixtures, on paper at least, don't look quite as strong in the next 2 at the very least. Obviously, I've already discussed the fact that although the fixtures for Brentford over the next 5 on paper don't look that great, I think some of the matchups are really good for those attacking too. That being Johan Wissa and Brian Mbeumo, who I've already previously discussed. With that in mind, I actually don't massively hate going early on Wissa this week ahead of Man City at home, although, of course, it's not the ideal week to go for it, and if João Pedro or any other striker that you're looking at selling for him this week has any sort of decent fixture, you probably don't need to sell them anyway. So maybe this is a player that can wait a couple of weeks. But even having that dangled in front of me, the idea of Wissa, even in a couple of weeks' time, is, I think, a little bit more tempting to me than going early on Jimenez now and then maybe wanting to make a move in a couple of weeks away from him. I'd almost want to save the transfer now unless I absolutely had to make a move. And even if I did have to make a move, I'd be pretty tempted to look at Wissa as an early buy anyway, especially if I had a strong 8 and can find a way to bench him against Liverpool at home. So a couple of Crystal Palace players that we have to talk about before wrapping up the video, the first of which is probably the defender to bring in this week, maybe outside of Lewis Hall, but I think everyone's been talking about Lewis Hall at the moment. He's a very obvious buy with Wolves at home, so he's obviously a great pickup. You can also look at maybe the Fulham assets as well, although I think if you're looking at those players, you should definitely also be looking at Daniel Munoz, who has fantastic data and is really well priced. 4.7 million, so differential, under 10% owned, in fact only slightly over 5% owned right now, and the XG per 90 is the best amongst any defender in the game right now, even better than some of the centre-backs with goal threat from set pieces, like a Gabriel for instance, like a Milenkovic, and also much better XG data than the likes of your most expensive defenders like Trent Alexander-Arnold too. Now, obviously, it goes without saying that the defensive data for Palace isn't on the same level as some of the very best, but it's also not bad at all. It's under 1.4 XGC per 90, which is actually not that bad for a mid-table club. And when you've got this kind of attacking data, especially the goal threat, and goals are so important for defenders, as we know, 6 points for a goal versus 3 points for an assist, it's twice as effective. So if you can find a defender that has significantly better goal threat than any other, it's much more effective than having a defender with significantly better assist threat. So if I was weighing up a decision between, let's say, a Munoz or a Robinson this game week, I've already got Robinson, I love owning him, he's been fantastic, but almost all of his threat is from assists, whereas Munoz, if he scores, he can cover off 2 Robinson assists with 1 attacking return. So the expectation, or I suppose the chances of a big haul are much higher for Munoz than they are for the likes of a Robinson. And I use Robinson as an example, but there are loads of defenders out there with good assist threat, but much lower goal threat that you could also use as examples here. With that in mind, Munoz, I think, is a fantastic pickup with the fixtures to come. Palace's fixtures all the way through to around game week 30 look really, really good. The next 2 are brilliant, but even after that, Brentford, Man United, Everton, it is undoubtedly a good run, and I can even see a few clean sheets in there as well to accompany, hopefully, some attacking returns. Munoz has been ridiculously advanced in recent weeks, and his attacking data, the XG per 90, is on an upwards trajectory. Again, even from this point, is very, very promising. And although, much like Newcastle, they've got a decent chance now of blanking in game week 29 because they go up against each other that week, Newcastle look fairly likely to get to the Carabao Cup final at time of recording. That is a long way away, and I probably wouldn't be too worried about loading up on Palace or Newcastle assets just yet. Maybe just have an eye on an escape route, or maybe, be accepting of the idea that you might want to free hit in game week 29 if you find yourself in a position with 6 players from those 2 teams. Now, I did say before wrapping up the video that I'd talk about 2 Crystal Palace players, the second of which is Jean-Philippe Mateta. Now, I could easily talk about Sarr or Eze in the midfield as well, both good options, but given we've talked about a lot of midfield options already in this video, and a lot of them around that sort of price point, I think let's not waste any time here. They're both good options in their own right, but one player that hasn't been spoken about enough over recent weeks has been Jean-Philippe Mateta. Up front, 7.2 million, a little bit more expensive than the likes of Jimenez or Wissa, who I've already talked about, but I think that he could himself be a very good differential pickup over the next few game weeks. We've already discussed the fixtures from a defensive point of view for Palace, but again, from an attacking point of view, they look fantastic. You've got Leicester, who are amongst the worst in the league. I think maybe slightly better than Southampton, but again, in the bottom couple for XGC per 90. West Ham under new management, so we don't know how that's going to look just yet, but again, they've been very leaky all season and susceptible to some big hauls against them. Brentford, who again are gung-ho in their nature, they're not a very tight defensive outfit. Man United and Everton. So it's not a bad set of 5. The expected points over the next 5 are 25.1. That's over 5 points a game. That's your bread and butter. That's very, very decent. And although the attacking data so far this season hasn't been spectacular, the fixtures coming suggest to me at least that there's an opportunity here to pick up a player that I believe is slightly underpriced, is very differential at the moment. Almost nobody owns him, under 5% of the game. And I think the data suggests to me that he can improve. And given that last season he didn't even have penalties, this season he's picked them up off of Eze, he's got another feather in his cap. I think that he could be one of those differentials that, although doesn't look like the most exciting on paper because of the data just yet, we might be about to see an uptick. And I think that this data, if you talk to me in 3 or 4 game weeks time, could look much more close to 0.45, 0.5 XG per 90. And hopefully we've seen a couple of hauls by then as well. So then, let me know what you think of all of the players that I've talked about in this video today, and in some of the key matchups I've discussed, let me know which ones you prefer in each case. If there are any players at all that I haven't spoken about today, just feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll try and get back to every single one of you before we hit the Game Week 21 deadline. In the meantime though, thank you all so much for watching. If you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel, that'd be greatly appreciated. But I'll see you next time as we start running through things like chip strategy and team selection ahead of the deadline.